One of the tricks of humility is is feeling justified. We often feel justified in not being humble. We look at things in the world. We say, well, this is this way, or that is that way, or I earned this, or I did that, and we have a lot of sense of entitlement, and entitlement's a really big enemy of humility. It's hard to be humble when you're entitled, right? I mean, you think, well, even just from the Middle Ages, the idea of a landlord who has a title, and that title is that they have a right over the land, right? And so they were entitled. And so even to this day, we have this idea of being entitled in things. I deserve this, I deserve whatever. And the more entitled we are, the less humble we are. They just don't go together very easily. I mean, you can be a humble person with entitlement, that truly has a right, I should say. But it's just very difficult. It is often the enemy of humility. So this kind of brings me to the subject for today's little think about session here, and this is the idea of what is privilege. What's this idea of privilege? It's a word you hear a lot nowadays. The idea of privilege, and so I looked up for definitions. I checked a couple definitions and my own wording here, but it seems the consensus is that somehow a privilege is basically an advantage someone has, usually an undeserved or an unearned advantage, just an advantage they have for whatever circumstance. It may be an earned advantage, but it may not be. And so the key isn't whether or not it was earned, not how the person got the privilege, but the fact that they have the privilege. So it could be because of a whole bunch of reasons, but a person in a game, for instance, who gets to play first has an advantage, right? So you could say they have a privilege. They were the first player. If you're playing in chess, perhaps, the person who plays the first move has the privilege of having the first bit of momentum in the game. They have the advantage. And so whether they got that because we randomly picked who would be the player that gets the first turn or not, doesn't matter. The fact is that there is an advantage. And so the player who's playing in the second turn now has to figure out how to deal with that advantage that the other person had and how to try and turn that in some way. And so it's just a thing. And so it's a thing in life. Privilege exists. It does. There's no sense debating that. But the interesting thing to me is how in our day and age, in our current cultural climate, there is an awful lot of this word being thrown around and attached to all sorts of different things, not as an observation so much as an accusation. It becomes this thing that somehow the person who has some privilege or another is somehow a villain, and there needs to be an opposition to this person who has some kind of a privilege. And there's various things. The most common one you will probably run into is the term white privilege. And this idea that a person's skin color somehow gives them an advantage in certain situations, this one or another one, and it depends on the situation. But in different situations, you'd say, well, that skin color of being white gave them an advantage in that circumstance because of this or that, whatever. So that's one you'll commonly hear, white privilege. But it's also other things too. You'll hear the idea of male privilege, that being a male gives you certain advantages in certain situations. And so having just simply by the virtue of being a man, you get an advantage in certain circumstances. So that would be male privilege. Or straight privilege. That's one you don't hear as often, but there's this idea that just because you have a traditional view of sexuality, that gives you an advantage in certain situations. Or there's another one that's starting to, we see it rising more and more, this idea of is it called able privilege or something to this effect? The idea that a person who doesn't have a physical handicap has a privilege. Or I've seen some people talking about thin privilege, right? People who are not overweight, that are of a regular weight or even a lower, underweight perhaps even, that there's an advantage they have in life. And if they go on a plane, they're going to be more comfortable than the person who's large is not going to have the same. The chair isn't going to be designed for him, and so there's a privilege or an advantage to the lower weight category. Or age. I've heard this one. The privilege of being older, that you have advantages that young people don't have. And so being there's an age privilege. And These are probably the most common ones we're running into right now. There's a whole, I mean, you can basically do this with anything, right? There's all kinds of things that cause advantage in our world. Tons of things that cause advantage, but these are the ones that are kind of in the spotlight right now. And it's an interesting thing, the idea of privilege. And as I said, my concern with the whole idea isn't the discussion of are there advantages or not. I mean, clearly there are advantages to different things. My concern is how our society has become very obsessed with the idea of advantage, as if somehow the person who has an advantage has done something wrong. And as the person who doesn't have that advantage is somehow a victim. And that's a little more concerning. As I said, we can apply this to anything. There's all kinds of things in life. I mean, we can think about things like wealth, right? Wealth privilege. People with a lot more money tend to have certain advantages. I think it's very clear to see. There's an advantage to having money that doesn't exist if you don't have the money. Being English, right? Having being able to speak English in a community like the one I live in is certainly an advantage. If you can't speak English, if you're an immigrant perhaps that hasn't learned English, I mean, you're at a disadvantage. There's no doubt about it. It's education can be an advantage. There used to be when I was younger this whole idea of blonde. They didn't use the word privilege, but there's a benefit to being a blonde woman. Like that somehow men would treat you better because you were blonde. I mean, I remember that one from my youth. Being a Canadian, right? Being a Canadian citizen has a lot of privileges attached to it. Just the fact that you were born or live in or have citizenship in this country, it's amazing advantages to that aren't shared with people in other countries. And one that really has affected me in my life is height privilege, right? I don't have height privilege because I'm not a tall guy. I'm 5 foot 4 inches, and I think a little more, certainly more in the morning, and maybe as the day goes on, I shrink a little. I don't know, but the height thing. As I grew up, being always being the shortest guy in my class at school, it meant that I was often a target for bullies, or that I was often not able to have the same advantages in a sports game, playing basketball, as all my friends loved to play basketball. I became a very good basketball player back in the day, but I had to work for it because I was shorter than everyone else in the school. So it was a challenge, and others that were taller had more of an advantage, or we might say today, privilege of being a taller person. There's all these things. The thing is, whatever definition we decide to go with, however we want to understand, I hope that today we can agree that that's a valid use of the term, even in today's climate. That's what people mean when they're talking about privilege or talking about an advantage. And that's really important to understand what I'm about to say next. Because I am concerned, and I think that there's something for us to think about in this when we're trying to sort out the details of privilege and what we should do about privilege. It's important that we realize that's what we're talking about. Now, my concern is this. We become obsessed with the idea of removing privilege. But that's not really possible. You can't remove it. You can't undo it. You can shift who has it, but you can't undo it. And shifting it from one person to another person, that's a tricky thing to do, right? So if you think back to my example of chess, you can say, well, the player who plays first has an advantage, has privilege. So we should turn that around. Let's let the other player play first. Well, then that player has the advantage. We'll have to play 2 games so that both get to play as the first player once, and that makes it fair, right? Well, no. Who gets to play first? Because there's an advantage. That person wins his game, perhaps, and that sets a mood for the second person. So, well, okay, how are we going to do that? We're going to play 4 games, and one will play first, and then the other one will play first twice, and then the other person. And we start to kind of come up with all these systems and methods to somehow remove all advantage and what we would call privilege, or to shift it around. And we just can't do that as much as we try. In fact, I would argue the scriptures are actually kind of clear that you're never going to be able to eliminate these asymmetries in humanity. I mean, one place the scripture said, you will always have the poor with you. That doesn't mean you ignore the poor, you help the poor, but you will always have them with you. That's not a command. That's just an observation that God makes in the scriptures. It's going to be this way. There's always going to be asymmetries. There's going to be somebody who is bigger, stronger, more powerful, more wealthy, smarter, whatever. It's always going to be that way. And the answer to that is not removing that guy's advantage, right? Making the stronger man weak, making the richer person poor, making the smarter person stupid, right? But this is what our world seems to be thinking, that we will solve the problems of imbalance by removing the advantage from the person who has it. It's another way of basically saying life's not fair. And the answer to that is not saying we're going to make sure that everything in life is equal. It's to realize and just accept the fact that life isn't fair. That's true. It's not fair. Life isn't fair. And there's an awful lot of parts of life that are beyond our control. So as I was growing up in school, and I would be the kid that had to work harder because of my height disadvantage, right? And so I had to work harder with my peers to be able to compete in the sports I would compete in, or to be able to stand up to the bullies, the bigger kids. And I got pretty good at it. And, people didn't bully me very often after a while. They learned it wasn't really worth it. But I had to do things. I had to work with my disadvantage in order to find a way to compete and be in the world. The answer to that problem would not have been to wear elevator shoes, right? And act as if I was taller than I was. Or to tell all the other kids that they were going to have to crouch as they played their sports. They all have to crouch. It would not have been the answer. For me to simply yell at the world and say it's not fair, and then live in this state of discontent, well, that's not very humble. It's actually better for a person who finds themselves in an unfair situation to just simply accept the fact that it is unfair. It is. But, okay, well, what am I going to do with this? This is the situation I have, so what am I going to do with this? You can't help your situation all the time. But what the scriptures tell us, so for instance with the poor, what the scripture tells us, you will always have the poor, and so you need to take care of the poor. The person with advantage needs to help those without advantage. Not by throwing away your advantage, but by using it in a way that helps those that don't have the advantage. That's kind and generous and considerate and cares about the person who's in the less equal situation and does things to try and help them. That's a good and virtuous use of privilege, of advantage. But it's a bad use of it to look at that person and force that person to do it. Then that's no good. God tells us when we give our gifts to Him, we should do it with a cheerful heart, not an obligated heart. And there's many scriptures actually that kind of emphasize this idea that it shouldn't be that we only do what's right just because we have to, but instead we do righteousness out of a place of true, sincere care for one another, right? This obsession with privilege and trying to offset and force this remove, it's kind of like, another way to look at it, it's kind of like people yelling all the time, "You cheated." They didn't cheat, right? I like video games, and I have found that in the video games I play, which are often competitive, there are online groups of people competing with each other, and I'm amazed and somewhat, discouraged by how often when one player does really well and they really lead their team to victory, how the players on the other team will start to claim that the person used hacks and cheated, and he's, in some way he rigged the system, or they'll blame the game company itself. They'll say this game is rigged, and it's so amazing how often people that find themselves losing in a scenario are so quick to blame the winners for having cheated in some way. In some way, you had an unfair advantage, right? You cheated the system, and that's really not very mature, really. It's not. That's not the way to deal with a loss or with a disadvantage in life. The admirable person is not the person who yells about how much the other guy must have cheated, but is the person who stands up and faces the disadvantages of their life and conquers anyway, succeeds anyway. That person's an admirable. Those are the stories we like to see and hear, aren't they? Don't you love to go to a movie about the underdog and he was disadvantaged, but he found a way, even though he was disadvantaged, he found a way to conquer, to make it, to make something of himself, to deal with his disadvantage, and it's amazing, you know. Like we look at the physics genius of Stephen Hawking, you know, and suffering with his disease, this debilitating physical disease, and yet very brilliant in his mind. We're not amazed at him because all the other physics people were told that they were going to have to live in a similar situation as him. We wouldn't be very impressed by that. We're impressed that he faced his difficulties and still rose to the highest levels in his field, or you know, a person who struggles in the Olympics struggles to get to where they're at, and they triumph even with all the obstacles they had to face. That's impressive. Or the musician who goes to the concert and is playing their violin and a string breaks, but they don't miss a beat and they just keep playing. We're impressed. Well, but that wasn't fair. They lost a string, and stop everything. All you other violinists, let's all break a string. No, that wouldn't have been impressive. That would have been stupid, right? I mean, no, what we look at that and we go, man, that person had a disadvantage, but they still went on and made something out of it. That's impressive. And I think we need to understand that the idea that the world is pushing right now is that if you're in an unprivileged position, then you're a victim. And they seem to be pushing this idea that you need to live in that, live as a victim. But a victim is not a person who's had a bad thing happen to them or had anything happen to them. A victim is a mentality. It's a way of thinking. Victors have a way of thinking. Victims have a way of thinking. I'm not a victim of the sunrise. Neither am I a victor of the sunrise. The sun simply rose. Now, what I'm going to do with this day, that's up to me. And how I think about my day is going to help determine what I do with my day today. Not whether or not I caused the sun to rise. It just rose. But I can be a victim today if I decide that today came too quickly and I wasn't ready for it. And I didn't get enough sleep. And other people live in a warmer part of the place. And the sun doesn't shine through the trees on me the same way as it shines on that. And then I'm defeated today. But if instead I say, no, I'm going to get up, I'm going to get dressed, I'm going to make my day, I'm going to go out and do something with my day. Well then, yeah, then I can make something of my day, and I could be more than my start. See, privilege does exist. It really does. There are advantages. And the ones I mentioned earlier are the ones that are very popular now, but there's advantages to the other side too. Yeah, there's advantages to being white, and there's advantages to not being white. There are. There are advantages to being, disabled, right? Disabled people get certain advantages in this world that the able don't get. There are. The young have advantages that the old don't have. There are advantages that women have that men don't have. There definitely are. It's not really about which advantages you have. It's about how you're going to face the situation you're in with humility rather than entitlement. And trust that God can help you be more and to use whatever advantages you do have to make the world around you a better place. Anyway, something to think about today.